Along the drive, she flashes back to when she left Katie to eat strawberry pancakes at a local diner and kissed her goodbye before surrendering herself to the cops outside. The movie begins 20 years ago when Ruth Slater was convicted of murdering a sheriff, Mac Whelan, during a fierce altercation due to an unscheduled eviction at her house in Snohomish, Washington. Her incarceration led to her 5-year-old sister being separated and placed in a foster home. The day finally arrives for Ruth to be released from the women's prison after serving her sentence in full capacity. The release process is under the supervision of parole officer Vincent Cross. Ruth's belongings and an envelope containing $40 are returned upon leaving. On another part of town, her sister Katie, known as Catherine Malcolm after the adoption, finishes a get-together with friends at a local diner. While driving, she sees flashbacks of unrecognizable childhood memories, though she cannot explain why she is experiencing them. The images are so horrific that it distracts her to the point that her car gets slammed by another vehicle at the intersection. Simultaneously, a hopeful Ruth exits the prison gate while being escorted by Cross. She hops inside the officer's vehicle and drives to a temporary shelter. Unbeknownst to her, a man, Keith, has been surveilling her outside the prison's parking lot. Along the way, Cross explains her need to adjust to society by getting a job. Still, she clarifies she is offered to work as a carpenter. He leaves her a card for a seafood processing plant, just in case her present work opportunity falls through. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Katie is visited by her adoptive family, who checks in on her condition. Later, Ruth arrives at the Elizabeth D. Adams House, a support shelter for troubled women, and is informed by Cross to meet regularly every Tuesday at 11 a.m. without fail or risk breaking the parole agreement. Inside the building, the landlady reluctantly welcomes her to a bunkroom with 3 other women as her roommates. Some time afterward, Keith visits his younger brother, Steve, at his workplace to inform him about seeing Ruth leave prison. It turns out that the men are children of the sheriff she shot in cold blood. Visibly enraged by what he saw, Keith suggests they exact revenge on their father's killer. Still, Steve is hesitant, pleading with his brother to let go of his past feelings. Later at night, while Katie spends time with her sister in the hospital room, the Malcolm couple discusses what led to her tragedy. Michael Malcolm does not believe her brief visions correlate to Ruth's release day, despite his wife, Rachel's opposing opinion. Simultaneously, Ruth sets up her new analog flip phone when she gets a call from Keith, who calls her a cop killer, before she hangs up. Upon returning to her room, she catches a female junkie perusing through her stuff and beats her up. She then recovers an old photo of a 5-year-old Katie as memories flood. The following day, Ruth is kept awake by the memories of the incident. Little does she know that her old house has been recently occupied by a new family, the Ingrams, John, a corporate lawyer, his wife Liz, and his 2 sons, Ryan and Daniel. They are going through a renovation, as the house has been abandoned for many years. While Liz gives a pep talk to her kids, the contractor finds a pair of baby boots hidden inside the walls. She asks the man to leave it where it is, believing it is a precious family heirloom. Meanwhile, Ruth steps out of the building to attend her job interview at the carpentry company. However, despite her qualifications, the manager turns down her application, having learned about her previous felony charges. Ruth decides to move on to the seafood warehouse job Cross suggested. Upon arriving, she is immediately immersed in the workplace, processing different fish for supermarket distribution. Looking around, she discovers that many of the workers are immigrants. She then meets Blake, who teaches her how to properly chop off a fish's head. After her shift, he offers her a ride to her home, but she declines. The next day, after enduring harsh treatment from one of the women in the support home, Ruth leaves to continue her search for Katie. She enters a public library and uses the computer to do Google searches for Katie's social media presence but finds many results for Katie Slater. She soon discovers a news clipping about her old house getting sold on the market, prompting her to travel to Snohomish to see the Ingram family. While standing far from the newly renovated home, Liz spots her, alerts John, and asks him to find out what she wants. The friendly lawyer makes pleasantries, as Ruth claims she used to work on the house as a carpenter. He invites her inside to see the finished remodeling and introduces her to Liz, who mentions discovering the baby shoes. While the couple talks to her, Ruth starts flashing back to all the memories of her time with Katie inside the house. Overcome with emotion, she excuses herself to leave. Still, John sympathizes with her and offers to lift her to the bus station. However, as they arrive, John opens up about his suspicions of Ruth, believing she is a distressed woman needing legal counsel. Ruth comes clean and reveals about living in his house years ago and going through the welfare system, forcing Katie to get put up for adoption. Knowing she needs help to find her, John gives her a card to contact him at the office so that he can assist her in any way. At the Malcolm family home, Katie is at home resting after her hospital discharge. After her mom leaves, she talks to her sister, Emily, about her nightmares, which are memories of her childhood that she cannot seem to piece together. She notes hearing music on the piano and moments with Ruth, who she does not recognize. Elsewhere, Ruth passes by a construction site for a donation-based community center. The contractor for a position initially turns her down. Still, her knowledge of carpentry impresses him enough to ask her for references. Cross visits the site days after Ruth gets the job to check her state of mind. He warns her that she must be open to her employer about being a felon, as she must accept that she killed a police officer, even though she is trying to live an everyday life again. The next day, after another shift at the seafood processing plant, Ruth is about to walk home when Blake insists on getting her a ride. She relents and gets to know the friendly man along the drive while appreciating his music. She then asks Blake to drop him off at the construction site, revealing that it is her second job. As she leaves the truck, Keith stalks her from outside the building. Later, she calls John for an update on her case, but he ignores her call after finding out about the murder of the sheriff in an online news article. After doing some carpentry work, she takes a break and reminisces on the last time she was with Katie in a diner. Suddenly, a man calls out her name from downstairs. Thinking he is an intruder, she strikes him with a tool, only to find out it's Blake carrying a box of donuts. She finds out he visited to bring her comfort and a jacket to keep her warm. The man, visibly infatuated with her, apologizes before leaving her to her work. A day later, Ruth leaves a voice message for John, revealing all the parts she left out in her story, including the conviction. She hopes he will help her locate Katie and arrange a meeting with her foster parents to resolve the issue. While John thinks it over in his office, Liz finds out from the house workers that Ruth was the previous occupant of the home until the murder of Sheriff Whelan. Elsewhere, at a celebration, Steve finds out from a detective friend that he has been passing along information about Ruth's whereabouts to Keith. Visibly upset by this revelation, he confronts his brother outside and pleads with him to stop following her. Still, Keith is unsatisfied and wants justice for their father's killer. Later at night, Liz confronts John about Ruth's predicament, believing it is risky to invite a felon inside their home. He tries convincing her to let him take the case about Katie since she is a victim of the welfare system. Still, Liz is more concerned with protecting her kids and wants him to keep Ruth away from them as far as possible. The following morning, Steve visits his elderly mother in hospice care. He is reminded of his dad upon seeing his memorabilia and photographs plastered around the room, making him think about Keith's proposition. He drives to the construction site and sees Ruth lifting lumber from a pickup trip. He approaches cautiously and pretends to be a worker by helping her lift the wood pieces. Steve then briefly talks to Ruth, unaware of his true identity, while inspecting the area. He mentions her parents, as Ruth claims they have passed away. After apologizing, he hears her say, "Life goes on," which is a response that Keith is also irritated with. Steve pretends to leave but returns secretly when Ruth steps out. Going through her belongings, he discovers the old photograph of a 5-year-old Katie, along with a letter, and takes a picture of them with his phone. Later, Ruth apologizes to Cross for being late for her appointment but shrugs off his advice to let go of her search for Katie. Some days pass as Ruth and Blake become more acquainted with each other after their shifts at the plant. At the Malcolms' house, Michael receives a letter from John's corporate office and immediately calls his wife. Elsewhere, Steve meets with Keith to admit his feelings about Ruth had some merit and that they must do something to avenge their father's death. Another day passes, and Blake takes Ruth to a local diner for some pancakes. Memories of Katie start flashing in her head upon seeing the food, compelling her to tell him the truth about being a murderer and getting locked up for 20 years. This revelation leaves Blake speechless, so Ruth leaves abruptly in tears, believing he hates her for her past. At Katie's house, Michael and Rachel discuss their options on handling the letter, with the former refusing to take action to shield Katie from the truth. Rachel disapproves and feels more open to talking with Ruth now that her sister is an adult. Unbeknownst to the couple, Emily is eavesdropping on their conversation. The next day, Ruth is about to start her shift when she gets attacked by another worker who discovers her past crime. She shrugs off her injuries and returns to work as Blake stares at her. Unfortunately, her phone is broken from the attack, leaving her unable to contact anyone. She meets with Cross later in the day to tell him she is more determined than ever to find Katie despite her reputation. He tells her that John is trying to reach him about a meeting with the foster parents. A day passes, and after the Malcolms drop Katie off at school, they proceed to the law office and prepare to face Ruth in the presence of John. Meanwhile, Emily sifts her parents' belongings in their home, leading her to find Ruth's letters. After reading all of them, she bursts into tears. Later, During the meeting, Ruth discovers they have withheld the letters she wrote to Katie during her years in prison to prevent her from knowing the truth. Michael stands by this fact, believing she should stay away for Katie's sake. Almost immediately, Ruth bursts out of anger and shouts at Katie's parents, who stormed out of the meeting. The next day, after her shift, Blake apologizes for his actions at the diner, revealing himself as a former convict. He admits he empathizes with her, having also found it challenging to be accepted in society again. Later, while walking home, she gets a call from Emily, asking to meet her to talk about Katie. The next day, Steve continues surveilling Ruth's movements outside her building complex. He tries reaching Keith for a meetup but gets a voicemail instead. He later follows her to the meeting, where she agrees to see Emily. Ruth decides to wait for the young girl on a bench. She arrives shortly after, though feeling a bit nervous about conversing with her. The two women start talking without looking directly at each other. Ruth admits that she missed out on school because she cared for her baby sister. Feeling enthused, Emily asks about her time with Katie in their old place. Ruth remembers a few moments vividly, including her fondness for a horse Katie named Cheese since it is her favorite food. Emily mentions that her sister has become a skilled piano player. Before leaving, she tells her to come to see her performance in the Cornish Auditorium at 4 p.m. While a hopeful Ruth tries contacting John for the possible meet-up opportunity, Steve follows Emily to her home, thinking she is Katie. Moments later, he goes home and hears his baby cry upstairs. Not knowing where his wife is, he climbs to pacify his baby. However, upon entering the master bedroom, he is horrified to see Hannah having sex with his brother. As Hannah tries to apologize for her betrayal, Steve returns the baby to the crib. He walks back into the bedroom to angrily thrash Keith in anger. Completely blinded by rage, he goes to his mother's house and grabs his late father's pistol inside the drawer. Later, after Ruth discovers that John is away from his office for a whole week, she frantically journeys to his house to speak to Liz. However, upon arriving, she is immediately shunned away by her, believing her problem should not be piled on her family. They have a brief argument about morality until Ruth suddenly admits that Katie is the real culprit in the sheriff's death. She recalls that her young sister felt the need to protect her by grabbing the gun and shooting at the officer as he reached the basement. She took the blame for everything to keep her away from a traumatic experience. Liz becomes sympathetic after learning the truth and offers to drive Ruth to the auditorium to see the recital. Along the drive, she flashes back to when she left Katie to eat strawberry pancakes at a local diner and kissed her goodbye before surrendering herself to the cops outside. Shortly afterward, she arrives, but upon walking towards the auditorium, she receives a phone call from Steve, demanding she meets him at Harbor Island to rescue a kidnapped Emily. Believing he is Katie, she requests Liz to drive her to the location. Upon arriving, she enters the gated harbor on her own while Liz follows her gut feeling and calls the police. Steve guides her to a gray warehouse and lets her through the side door entrance. Ruth slowly approaches as a frantic Steve holds Emily at gunpoint. Simultaneously, Katie starts performing at the auditorium with a piece inspired by a song she learned with Ruth as a child. Meanwhile, Steve forces Ruth to drop to the ground to watch Emily die while believing she is her sister. He becomes distressed after she mentions his late father and starts pointing the pistol at her. Ruth reveals that the sheriff talked to him and his brother about giving her and Katie a place to sleep and had the eviction pushed through that sad day. She continues by expressing remorse for all that has happened and that he will not be able to live everyday life with his loved ones if he goes through with his plan. Filled with guilt, Steve puts the gun away and breaks down. Ruth slowly approaches Emily and unbinds her restraints before leaving the warehouse. She lets the young girl out before raising her arms to surrender to the police. Moments after Katie's successful solo performance and Steve's arrest, Officer Cross arrives at the scene and orders the police to uncuff Ruth and transfer custody to him since she is a parolee. As the pair walk back to the shuttle cruiser, Ruth sees the Malcolm family, including Katie, tending to Emily inside the ambulance. The young girl does not hesitate to approach her after clearly remembering who she is in her childhood. Without saying a word, Katie embraces her sister as fond memories of their time before the incident swirl in Ruth's head. The movie ends as she sheds tears of joy, realizing her mission to reunite with her is complete. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this to help the channel out. Have a nice day.